Sure. Favorite and for some computer moments, I guess.
All right, Alexander, do you think we can start?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to colleagues in the room. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to colleagues who have joined online. Welcome to the event. People with disabilities and armed conflict. Let's share actionable recommendations to break cycle of exclusion. This event has been organized by the International Disability Alliance. My name is Elham Yusufian. I work for the International Disability Alliance as the Senior Humanitarian Disaster Risk Reduction and Climate Action Advisor. I'm based in New York, but today I'm here in Geneva. First of all, this event is accessible via captioning and international sign. I think you can see the international sign interpretation on the screen. And then we do have captioning for colleagues who are joining us online. There is a link that you can click on it and just have access to captioning in a separate way. Otherwise, you can also see the captionings as well. If there is any challenges regarding the accessibility of the event, feel free to raise in the chat or email webinar team at idlsecretariat.org. Otherwise, here in the room, if there is any accessibility challenges, please feel free to raise with us and we will try to address that. Okay, so the event today is basically following two main goals. We want to first try to draw a picture of what persons with disabilities experience during armed conflict. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities have already published two reports addressing this issue. The first report, published in 2021, looked at the whole experience as a persons with disabilities in the peace continuum. And in his second report, the Special Rapporteur looked at persons with disabilities during military operations. In both reports, the Special Rapporteur found that persons with disabilities are very much overlooked, or as what he calls invisible, during armed conflict. And the response to armed conflict plans for that, as much as something like that can be planned, of course. So today, we are going to first hear about experiences of persons with disabilities from three kind of different contexts: Syria, Cameroon, and Ukraine. And after that, we are going to try to see what we can do to address that, those gaps that colleagues are raising, and break the cycle of exclusion. We will look at the experience, like what governments can do, what we can do in terms of further implementation and interpretation of international humanitarian law from disability perspective, and we try to discuss what we can do from the United Nations perspective. Of course, in that particular last one, we have a little bit of challenge because colleagues could not join us, no one from the UN system could join us, but we will try to address that anyway. And then after that, we will try to look into what each of us in our respective roles and responsibilities can do as something actionable and feasible to help to break this cycle of exclusion. But before everything, I want to invite Ambassador Petro Kohaki, who is the ambassador of Finland on rights of persons with disabilities, to provide some opening remarks. Finland has been a true support for the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur, for the International Disability Alliance, and for the disability movement to ensure that persons with disabilities are being included in global, regional, and national processes. It's a great ally. So Ambassador, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, and I invite you to provide opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Elham. I hope everybody can hear me properly. So as was mentioned, my name is Petri Puhakka, and my current position is the Ambassador for Disability Inclusion at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. So, dear colleagues, friends, and experts, I would like to start by extending my warm thanks to the organizers of this important and timely event, and for providing Finland the possibility to co-sponsor and participate in it. Finland underscores the importance of the rules-based international systems, its obligations, and universal and binding nature of human rights. Ensuring that persons with disabilities can fully exercise their rights is a prerequisite for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And for these reasons, rights of persons with disabilities are a priority in Finland's human rights-based foreign and security policy, development cooperation, and humanitarian assistance. As we know, about 15% or every 3 persons out of any given 20 in the world are living with some kind of type of disability. And this number does not account for those indirectly affected by discrimination, exclusion, or barriers that come with disabilities, just as family members or caregivers. Additionally, due to discrimination and stigma, many persons with disabilities and their families often do not report to authorities or humanitarian organizations, and so this figure is probably even much higher, has been estimated as high as 30% in the recent publication by the ICRC. Armed conflicts also increase this number, as many more people are getting impairments. Persons with pre-existing disabilities face additional challenges and risks once an armed conflict breaks out. Accessing and receiving the basic services and necessities for survival, such as food, water, sanitation, shelter, healthcare, become very difficult, if not impossible. Women and girls with disabilities are particularly at risk of exploitation and violence, including gender-based violence and sexual abuse. Fearing for their lives and security, when many are forced to flee their homes, persons with disabilities are often left behind, or simply cannot leave, facing challenges and barriers exacerbated by different types of armed conflicts. Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or CRPD, sets out steps that states need to take to create an enabling environment, so that persons with disabilities can fully enjoy and effectively participate in society on an equal basis with others. State parties to the convention are obliged to ensure that all persons with disabilities are fully included and can meaningfully participate through their own organizations in all activities that impact them. In situations of armed conflicts, the CRPD plays an important and complementary role to ensure that protection of persons with disabilities and their rights, which is made explicit through the application of Article 11. Persons with disabilities clearly continue to be among those who are most impacted by various types of disasters, be it natural or man-made. And at the same time, they are more likely to be excluded from emergency preparedness, related decision-making processes. So they continue to be invisible. There's clearly a need to change the narrative of persons with disabilities and move away from seeing them as objects to be managed or cared for, and realize the potential that they have as such subjects capable of steering their own lives and playing a significant role in societies. As we have visited the humanitarian country operations of the large partners we fund, we see that there is limited understanding of who are persons with disabilities and a limited understanding of what their inclusion would mean. There are no standardized questions in use to see who are persons with disabilities or what their needs are. This means that while our partners have global strategies for disability inclusions and roadmaps to implement them, at country level, we simply do not know if persons with disabilities are included in aid or if their specific needs are met. Together, we need to do better and we need to do more. The Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Mr. Jared Quinn, has presented 2 reports to the UNGA, as already mentioned by Alan. Already in the first one, it was found that persons with disabilities were relatively or absolutely invisible along all points of the peace continuum. There were also several recommendations, as usual, that various parties should take up to remedy the situation. So there is clearly still a lot to do to change the present situation of invisibility. And that's why these kind of events are important and valuable. And I'm confident that after today's discussion with the distinguished panelists, we will get some concrete takeaways to advance this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Pedri Puhaka, Ambassador of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland on disability inclusion, for your very helpful, clarifying opening remarks. That actually what you just mentioned about building how the disasters, conflict, and everything happen sometimes, fortunately, most of the times at the same time. And also the fact that organizations of persons with disabilities can play a significant role in breaking this cycle is already taking us to our next section. In the first segment of our event, we are going to try to give a picture of what's happening to people with disabilities in armed conflict. We're going to start by going to Syria. Mr. Navef Kabara, who is the president of Arab Organizations of Persons with Disabilities and also the board member of the International Disability Alliance, is going to tell us what happened to persons with disabilities during the conflict in Syria, which we all know was quite complicated. There were impacts of climate change happening. Recently, we had the earthquake, which was really devastating in the country. And also there are many security and political challenges and considerations. So Navaf, I specifically appreciate you participating. I know that in Lebanon and many of the countries in the region today is a public holiday. So happy Eid to you and your family. And thank you so much for dedicating your time to us in this holiday. And floor is yours.
Thank you, Ilham. I'm always under your disposal to participate in such important meetings. Well, regardless whether it is man-made or nature-made, persons with disabilities are paying the price of conflicts and natural disasters. I'm very sad to inform you of the death of the second vice president of the Union of Blind People in Sudan, hit by a bullet in the late conflict taking place just this week. What happened in Sudan now showed us how much persons with disabilities are left and are vulnerable in situation of conflicts. When the earthquake took place in Syria and Turkey, I was directly in contact the next day with our Syrian counterparts in Aleppo and nearby places where the earthquake hits hardly. And the images that I got from there and the direct report showed how devastating the situation was. I don't know until this moment how many persons with disability have lost their life as a result of the earthquake. That's something we cannot contemplate. It happens suddenly. That's a natural made disasters. However, what we can control and affect is our treatment, management, and administration of the situation. In Aleppo, when the weather was around 4 degrees centigrade, people with physical disability in particular were in the streets without any shelter because they have left their places, their homes, and they went into the street to get away from the earthquake place, but without finding any accessible shelter they can get into it. Many of them spent their night in the streets. I repeat, was between 0 and 4 degrees centigrade. Then aid started to arrive to Syria. However, what is interesting is the lack of any aids directly related to persons with disabilities. These observations showed clearly the lackness at the level of the united community, at the level of different agencies, of tackling ahead of time the need of persons with disability in the situation of conflicts and disaster. Let me start by saying, especially after the Sudan conflicts, that maybe we have to review the Geneva Treaty and add to it special clause related to the responsibility of the fighting parties toward not only civilians, but also toward persons with disabilities, and what they have to do to avoid being affected. The CRPD may not be enough to clearly deal with this issue. So there is work at the legal level that we need to address. The second level, I think, is of vital importance, is for relief agencies, when they're preparing their list of things they need to send in the places of crisis, included should be the special needs of persons with disabilities. And this goes, as you know, much beyond tents, covers, and clothes, into wheelchair, different assistive devices, and so on. The third issue of also vital importance is that their person with disability and the agencies at the national level who deal with disaster, there should be some training and communication on what is to be done in the case of conflict and disaster. Whom to contact, what is supposed to be done, what kind of equipment materials need to be ready, how to deal with persons with deafness, therefore there should be some sort of sign language interpretation, how to deal with blind people, how to deal with people with intellectual disability, and of course, how to deal with people with mobility problems. And there should be ahead of time training. Persons with disability should be also trained of what to do in this situation, where to go, whom to contact, where they can find the things they need, whom to address. The linkage are OPDs and also service organization that could provide lots of needed services at the time of crisis, including medical and rehabilitative services. These kind of practices that never took place. Worse, when they started to build up the camps for the affected people by the earthquakes, unfortunately, there were no accessible tanks and there were no accessible toilets. This is the same situation that we saw and faced with the refugee crisis. I'm sure if you'd like to report on the Ukrainian crisis now, I doubt that the situation will be different. Ladies and gentlemen, the world, unfortunately, is heading toward more conflicts. And the heat for wars is increasing. We have to be realistic and expect much worse situations. The climate change is a reality and is affecting us every moment. Just lately, we saw what happened in Pakistan and many other places as a result of climate change. I heard that in Ireland now, there's some sort of, in Europe, many places in Europe, there is some sort of dryness, lack of water, also as a result of climate change. Standard people may go and get water from wherever they want. Persons with ability, especially people who are living independently, will be faced with their destiny of no support, even for water. Yes, we can do a difference just by preparing ourselves to deal with the situation, by knowing ahead of time what is to be needed, who is going to provide it, who is going to work on the ground, who is going to be trained to do the job, who has the data, how to do the connection, what kind of hotline, who's going to finance it. All these answers could be dealt, all these questions could be answered and dealt with if we start now of facing these challenges, and it could be done. I'm really amazed after so many disasters lately, starting at least in the Arab world from 2011, nothing serious has taken place. There was some documents, I remember I was involved in some of them in Spain and many others, to highlight some sort of theoretical approach of to deal with it. It is time to, especially after the conflict, different conflicts, this earthquake and the conflict in Sudan, to re-examine them, to re-examine these books and booklets, and add to it the COVID-19 disaster, and deal directly with effective strategies of intervention, of training, of communication, of knowing what to do. Like any army who prepare themselves for war and thinks of everything, including logistics, training of the to use the arms and so on, strategies of fighting. Also, we need to have the same thing, an army of people, relief people, who knows how exactly what to do. They have the tool to do it, and they have the skills to deal with it. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Nawaf, for this great intervention. I'm really sorry to hear about what happened to our colleague, the person from disability movement in Sudan, who was unfortunately lost his life due to recent conflict. That's just one example of how people with disabilities as civilians may be targeted. We don't have the detail of that event, but usually, unfortunately, what we witness in events as such is that because of their disabilities, persons with disabilities do not access the commands that are being provided, and then sometimes it's been assumed as trying to be disobedient, because the military are not really trained, that some people may have disabilities. Like we had a case of a deaf person being shot in Uganda because they didn't hear, of course, because they were deaf. They couldn't hear the request to stop. And it was imagined that they are just trying to flee or do something wrong according to the rules that the military or the curfew that they had at place. So we have many of these are extreme examples, but we do have a lot of examples like that. Thank you so much for highlighting those, Nawaf. Recently, in the International Disability Alliance, we did a report on a situation of persons with disabilities in Ukraine. The report has been published just very recently, maybe today. I will try to send you in the chat on the screen. I don't know if the chat is visible in the room or not. Otherwise, all of those who have participated and registered gonna receive, and we're gonna also put it in the exhibition if it's still possible for you to take a look. Yeah. But for now, I'm going to ask my colleague Gerald Klein next to me, who is the head of advocacy in IDA. He's based in Geneva, who will tell us a little bit about what we found in that research about the experience of people with disabilities in Ukraine. Thank you, Gerald, and over to you.
Thank you, Ellen, and apologies. We're having some slight tech issues. The screen decided, Ellen, to turn itself off, which we were trying to address. Anyway, that wasn't in the report, but so indeed, we recently undertook a report. The title of the report is the situations of persons with disabilities in the context of the war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine. I see one half eyebrow raised. Of course, that title doesn't disguise the fact that we're talking about the conduct of hostilities and the situation of persons with disabilities in that conflict. But nonetheless, when you do see that title in writing, be aware that it was consciously chosen, although not a political position, just a, merely a legal fact. The important part of the report, though, is that we interviewed a large number of persons with disabilities, particularly organization of persons with disability representatives in Ukraine. It's a very simple idea. We want to find out the situation, then who should we talk to? We should talk to the people themselves. Not revolutionary, but perhaps maybe underdone. But we decided that was the most important thing to do. The report does contain some legal analysis, but really the most important part, as I said, is the stories, is the testimony of the individuals themselves. And it has many different components, but one part of it is the extent of consultation with organizations of persons with disabilities and persons with disabilities themselves by the Ukrainian government in the context of the conflict and what the situation is. We suspect that the situation is probably no different in many other conflict or humanitarian situations. So in a way, we probably feel it's illustrative of perhaps where the world is at. We note that there is an obligation not only under the CICG, but under paragraph 6 of Security Council Resolution 2475 to include persons with disabilities through their representative organizations. And if you'll indulge me, I will just read it off my phone here because I think it's important to know that the world has not been silent on these issues. There's been considerable normative progress. Also at the political level, you can't have a higher source than a Security Council resolution. And paragraph 6 urges member states to enable the meaningful participation and representation of persons with disabilities, including their representative organizations, in humanitarian action, conflict prevention, resolution, reconciliation, reconstructing, and peace building. So, in the words of Special Rapporteur Gerard Quinn, that really does represent the whole piece, the entire peace continuum. And right now we're at a particular stage in Ukraine. And in a way, the picture told there probably illustrates that there will be more work to do as they progress through the other stages of the peace continuum. So, essentially, what we found is that organizations of persons with disabilities in Ukraine have been crucial and supporting persons with disabilities during the war with evacuations, access to information, accommodation, services, medicine, food, humanitarian aid supplies, and more. In theory, this is the duty of the state to provide, and some of this has been with state resources, but often it's been through humanitarian assistance funneled through OPDs, or simply through their own resources and fundraising efforts. It's true that organizations of persons with disabilities have unique knowledge of the requirements and needs of persons with disabilities. And also, unfortunately, many persons with disabilities have remained in high-risk areas, dire conditions, separated from family and support systems, and taken on great personal risk in order to support other members of their community. Many OPDs are taking on new responsibilities, collecting data and information on the location and situation and condition of persons with disabilities, organizing shipments and distribution of food and other items, including to remote and dangerous locations, and fielding requests for assistance and organizing evacuations. But in that difficult context, many OPDs feel and felt that there'd been insufficient consultation and engagement with them on the part of government agencies, including informing them about policies and actions to ensure their protection despite serious risks faced. So it's crucial that government and humanitarian actors at all levels do seek out and incorporate the views and expertise of persons with disabilities. I'll read out a few segments of interviews which illustrate this picture. Oleg Lebetyuk of the Kharkiv Association of Blind Lawyers said, for the last 6 months in the city of Kharkiv, there has not been a single meeting between the authorities and persons with disabilities. Igor Ravenko, chair of the Ukrainian Society of the Deaf in the Mykolaiv region, explained that they decided to work with volunteer groups instead. The Mykolaiv government has done no outreach, nothing. We have to go ask, explain what people's problems are, what needs to be done. At the beginning of the war, I went to ask them for help. They asked for a list. I gave them a list. After a week, they gave a small item of a kit of 4 items. It felt like they were just checking a box. A wheelchair user and activist in the Geneva region said, no one has invited us to any consultations. If they have, it has been a tick box exercise. Everything has changed. Before, we were part of all different types of consultations. Nelia Lebetyuk of the Women, Youth and Family organization in Zhytomyr said, I think persons with disabilities should be part of the commission that determines the distribution of humanitarian support. Other organizations also gave examples of what you might call a retrogression in terms of consultation and meetings, as well as financial support that had reduced. So with all that said, it's clear that across Ukraine, for many different organizations of persons with disabilities covering different impairment types, the situation has in many respects gone backwards. We understand fully that the situation for the Ukrainian government is extremely difficult, fighting to maintain their territorial integrity. And so resources, time, energy for all of these processes are in a way going to be more constrained. But at the same time, on the other hand, we do have a Security Council resolution and other obligations which state there's a particular obligation and need to ensure that these kind of consultations are done. And what we take from all of this, I suppose, is not only a concern from the immediate situation, but also concern about what will happen when the conflict ends. Will organizations of persons with disabilities be included in any negotiation efforts, reconstruction efforts? Will they be integrated fully into all parts of the peace continuum and the process in a meaningful way? On the existing available evidence, I suppose one might have reason to doubt that. And so, of course, we urge not only the Ukrainian government, but all those who have influence on them, national partners, to encourage them to do so. We note also the Human Rights Council resolution which mandates the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, which recently did integrate that Security Council resolution language into the resolution adopted at the Human Rights Council 52nd session. So it's clear that there's both the international demand for that action, noting that the Ukrainian government is the main sponsor of that resolution. We hope that means there is a space for the necessary steps to be taken to ensure that Ukrainian OPDs are fully included in any mediation, conflict negotiation and post-conflict processes. We also know that this would probably be the first time such action would have been taken. It's not that other conflict situations give us have been better, give us more optimism. In a way, this is a litmus test, I suppose, for the impact and meaning and the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2475 and the international human rights framework in this regard. So that's the view from the ground in Ukraine, and we look forward with cautious optimism to what happens next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerald. For those online, I think my colleague who is supporting online tried to put the link to access the report in the chat. But in any case, as I said, we will make sure to put this in the exhibition and also share with all those who registered. I think documenting what's happening is a first and very important step towards breaking this cycle of exclusion that we were talking about today. So I hope that we and other organizations of persons with disabilities, other NGOs who are working on armed conflict, UN agencies, and everyone involved, academics, focus more and dedicate more resources to document these situations and gather evidence, so that we can draw their attention and resources required, the commitments required to make sure that persons with disabilities can access protection and safety as civilians, and also can participate, as Gerald was mentioning, organizations of persons with disabilities can participate in decision-making and planning related to this issue. So thank you so much, Gerald, for that. Now we are going to go online again and go to Africa, to Cameroon. We have with us Ms. Nonning Arnold, who's the regional president of the Association of Persons with Disabilities in the northwest of Cameroon, and also the founder of the Community Creative Center for Women and Girls with Disabilities in the country, in Cameroon. That's fantastic. Armelle has herself lived in conflict and has actually been forced to leave, so she's an internally displaced person as well, and will specifically focus on experience of women with disabilities during conflict. Armelle, thank you very much for joining us, and floor is yours. We don't hear you if you're speaking.
Sorry, I was still muted. Thank you, Elam, and thank you, everybody, for this great opportunity to be part of this panel, to share the experience of women with disability in armed conflict. Looking at the socio-political crisis has, over the years, continued to ravage the well-being of persons, women with disability in the affected region and the whole nation of Cameroon. Women with disability and people with disability in general, before the conflict, were faced with lots of hardship, which is sometimes described by scholars as a marriage of disability and poverty. So bring in the conflict, and the situation of is worsened, given that the little livelihood they were managing before to muster up has been taken away from them, along with a host of many more difficulties faced by women with disability. Women with disability in Cameroon have been badly affected by the onslaught conflict that has been ongoing. Some have been killed, some have been abandoned. Some have lost their shelters. Some have been forcefully displaced out of their homes, and others have lost their breadwinners. To add to the already existing horrors of either death, displacements, status, amongst others, the diversity of women with disability, including those with multiple and intersecting identities across all contexts, such ethnic as religious and racial backgrounds. The status of women with disability, their age, marital status, have been affected, and many, due to their forceful displacement, due to loss of their livelihood, have been unwillingly, because of means of looking for means of existence or survival, have been involved in situations that have led them to unwanted pregnancy, situations that have led them to STDs, sexual transmissible diseases, and this has exposed them to lower income and social status, increase of risks, violence, sexual violence and abuse, including gender-based violence, discriminatory practices. All of these have been experienced by women with disability in the conflict arms. Some of them it has come to us, led them to limited access to education, no access to health services, including sexual reproductive health information. They are lacking in that aspect. Little or no access to information of services such as justice for their rights, most especially those who have experienced violence. Due to these experiences, Elham and the rest, we had to carry out a research on women with disability who have experienced violence and what were the reasons. And we realized that some of them, the reasons why some of them keep silent, not to speak out, one of the reasons was because of lack of access to information. We are talking about a conflict where it is really complex, where two parties, if you have a case that have to do with legal procedures, the non-state armed group see you as a black leg and you are killed upon. And taking it to the non-state armed group, the military see you as one of the perpetrators of what is happening. So women with disability are vulnerable, are unable to speak out of what is happening. And some of them have become, due to hardship because of the conflict, most of women with disability have now gone to a point where they are ready for anything in the name of sex with any man who come across them, because they need a livelihood, they need something to survive. So I just want to give this reflection. What do you use your eyes for? What do you use your legs for? What do you use your hands for? What do you use your ears for? I push these questions in the context of the crisis. These questions in the crisis context will help you comprehend what women with disability face in any armed conflicts compared with non-disability women. So what is our next step? It is pivotal that any project or intervention designed to address the needs of women with disability in armed
Let's see if Arma can come back. Yeah. So unfortunately, as you see, we lost our Mel. Actually, the connection was pretty good. I don't know what happened, but any case, I think we got most of the message, but if she comes back, we will hear the rest of her intervention. But I think one thing that was very important, like very stood out for me, was like how she drew the picture from like how different things impact, like have a reinforcing impact, and how that exact cycle that we're talking about is happening. Like barriers accessing education, health, sexual and gender-based violence, and then which by itself like aggravates barriers in accessing health, education, income, and by again that aggravates the possibility of being exposed to sexual and gender-based violence. How these things like have unfortunately like a domino effect and work unfortunately all one after another, how they impact lives of women with disabilities. And also the difficulties and barriers that they face documenting and speaking up. And like that's why we don't have a lot of evidence out there, like or we cannot take those cases to the justice system. I think that's one huge gap that we face, and I hope to hear more about that later, is international, regional, and national justice for violence and crimes against persons with disabilities during armed conflict, which is not documented and is not really being listened. I mean, Gerald gave us a good example of how the fact-finding mission on Ukraine is going to hopefully pay attention, but I think it's a huge gap that still needs to be addressed. So that takes us to our next segment of our event, which was, okay, what we can do now. I mean, our speakers already touched that more or less when they were trying to give us a picture of what's going on. But more specifically, we want to talk first about the interpretation and implementation of international humanitarian law from disability perspective. For that, we have Alexander Bridiger from the International Committee of Red Cross. Alexander is a senior legal advisor with the International Committee of Red Cross. And Red Cross has recently prioritized disability inclusion in their work. So Alexander going to tell us what we can do or what we have already started to do to make sure that the international humanitarian law, which was, of course, developed at the time that CRPD did not exist, can be interpreted and implemented from disability perspective. Alexander, thank you so much for your time, and floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elham, and thanks so much to the International Disability Alliance, you, for hosting this side event. And I would also like to express my appreciation for the excellent cooperation together with IDA, but also with the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and his team, among other things, in trying to organize direct exchanges between persons with disabilities and armed forces. On that, I will say a little bit later on. And for the ICRC, of course, promoting a disability inclusive interpretation and implementation of IHL is, as you've put it, an institutional priority in line with our own organization's Vision 2030 on disability, which is designed to make us as an institution more inclusive for persons with disabilities. Regarding international humanitarian law, ensuring distinction between combatants and civilians, that attacks are not directed against civilians through positively verifying that a person in front of you is a military target. Ensuring effective advance warnings in communication formats that would be accessible to as many civilians as possible. Cooperating with local civilian authorities or other civilian actors in order, as a party to an armed conflict, to ensure accessible shelter and or temporary evacuations to allow civilians to leave, treating persons humanely when under the control of parties to armed conflicts, in screening operations, for instance, at military checkpoints or in detention. All of these, I would submit, are mainstream issues of international humanitarian law, IHL, not niche issues or luxury add-ons. Despite this, and the testimonies of OPD colleagues were a vivid illustration of this once again, persons with disabilities as part of civilian populations or in the power of parties to armed conflicts are insufficiently included in the interpretation and implementation of these core rules of IHL. Now, I would like to submit that what is required is not necessarily new rules or new specific protections, because there is always the risk, of course, if you go down that route, that what you will end up with might be less protective than what you had to start with. But it is about generally increasing the visibility, as we've also put it, of the specific risks that are faced with by persons with disabilities in the interpretation and implementation of existing IHL rules. And here the complementarity with the CRPD, which is explicit in its Article 11, helps in increasing this visibility substantively and procedurally. Substantively, because of the social and human rights model on disability, that this assists in broadening the analysis of risks faced by persons with disabilities, notably in the diversity of impairments, but also in relation to the variety of barriers that persons with disabilities face in an armed conflict. And then also there is an important procedural element to this, because a serious consideration of these barriers and risks also requires, as was already stressed, meaningful participation of persons with disabilities and OPDs in the interpretation and implementation of IHL. Now, a first step towards increasing visibility of persons with disabilities in the interpretation and implementation of IHL is the increased awareness of the barriers and resulting risks faced by civilians with disabilities during military operations in armed conflicts. And this is now the place where I would like to make the mention of regional consultations that either the UN Special Rapporteur and his team, as well as the ICRC, the European Disability Forum and Diakonia IHL Center, or co-organized last year. And the very process and fact of having persons with disabilities directly speak to militaries made a huge difference. Usually, it is mostly or traditionally that the ICRC or other stakeholders would relay the concerns of persons affected to militaries. But here you had that direct exchange, and these direct exchanges was really a great specific awareness raising for the militaries, as well as a capacity building of OPDs in international humanitarian law. It would be great if states could look into the possibility to organize more of these kinds of exchanges, be it on a national, regional, or international level. On a national level, there are national IHL committees or similar bodies that are forums of national interest in terms of dissemination, implementation of IHL. And they usually involve a variety of stakeholders. Synergies with CRPD national implementation mechanisms should also be explored. On an international level, it would be good to reflect on how to bring this issue to dedicated multilateral forums, like, for instance, the International Conference of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, but also seizing other opportunities where states can discuss thematic IHL issues could also be interesting. Within the UN, as has been mentioned, there is an obvious entry point where there is already UN Security Council Resolution 2475 that has been mentioned. However, the conversation with the UN should also become more concrete in terms of IHL related scenarios and how to address them. And direct participation of persons with disabilities, as well as state representatives with, for instance, a military technical background, for instance, military attachés where they exist, should also be more prominently brought into the conversation. Secondly, what I would like to stress is also that to date, and this goes to the issue of preparedness. Some military doctrine, in particular law of armed conflict or military manuals, address various protection of civilians issues, including the protection of children or the protection of women. The same, however, is not true for inclusion and protection of persons with disabilities. Now, including the specific barriers and risks also in their intersectionality with some of these other groups by civilians with disabilities in these manuals would ensure that this issue is on the radar of military commanders and planners. In some countries, we know that currently processes for revising these kinds of manuals are ongoing. And so it would be great to see how we could influence these processes. For instance, within governments, MFA human rights sections could be usefully influence their Ministry of Defense counterparts to support such integration. And furthermore, of course, ways should be found to better include OPDs in such processes. Such participation of OPDs and other civilian experts should also be included in more specific sensitization of armed forces. Again, talking to the issue of preparedness, which should be more practical hands-on training. For instance, in terms of cooperation and coordination of evacuations of civilians, including civilians with disabilities. And ideally, with time, such more specific sensitization would feed into more sustainable civilian military coordination mechanisms, which are very important operationally, of course, to ensure implementation of precautions like facilitation of temporary evacuations of civilians with disabilities. And this should also then finally result in more specific guidance concerning the behavior of armed forces in specific situations like checkpoint scenarios. As has been mentioned, in these instances, unfortunately, there have been instances where militaries in relation to persons with disabilities, mostly because of their awareness lacking, have meted out ill treatment to persons with disabilities, but have also inappropriately handled, for instance, assistive devices. Finally, and I will close with this, of course, for the ICRC, we are now making recommendations to others, but it is also important to mainstream protection and inclusion of persons with disabilities in our own activities in relation to IHL. This is happening to a certain extent already in current work, for instance, on updating the Geneva Convention, which the next will see the update of the 4th Geneva Convention commentaries and on urban warfare. And also in terms of promotion, I would like to finally mention one specific tool that could also be used to contribute to greater visibility of persons with disabilities in armed conflict. That was the latest edition of the International Review of the Red Cross. So I would like to stop here, but I'm looking forward to the further conversation on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for these great input. I mean, you already started speaking about what governments can do, but to really hear more even about that, like what governments can do to break this cycle of exclusion, we have with us William Pons, who is the Senior Legal Advisor to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and also he's a researcher with Harvard University. Thank you so much, William. So what government can do in this regard? In addition to what Alexander said.
Yeah, no, Alex covered a lot. So thank you, Alex. And I'm probably going to repeat quite a bit of what has been said. But first, I would like to thank IDA for organizing this event, and also thank all the sponsors, including the permanent missions of Finland and Switzerland, as well as the International Committee of the Red Cross, for sponsoring this important event. The Special Rapporteur, Mr. Gerard Quinn, apologizes for not being able to attend this event, but he sent me in his stead, so I'll do my best. As Elham already said, I am Senior Legal Advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur, and the goal of what I'm going to lay out is found within the most recent report to the UN General Assembly that was submitted by the Special Rapporteur in October 2022, but really what I'm going to provide are some actionable recommendations that states and their militaries can undertake to ensure more inclusive protection of persons with disabilities in armed conflict. Just to give a little bit of background, the protection of persons with disabilities and their human rights across the peace continuum, which has been stated already today, is a major focus of the Special Rapporteur's mandate. He's dedicated 2 reports, and a 3rd report will be forthcoming in October 2023 that will be presented to the UN General Assembly's 3rd committee, specifically focusing on peace building. However, for this event today, I will be talking about the report that examines specifically the rights of persons with disabilities in the context of armed conflict. Specifically, we looked at military operations and peacekeeping operations. The peacekeeping operations section was really focused on what the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations does in terms of training. They have trainings for women and children, but no trainings on the CRPD and persons with disabilities, which, as we can all imagine, is a fairly large gap since the CRPD is not particularly a new human rights treaty. It is new in general in terms of CEDAW and the CRC, but should be implemented. So what the Special Rapporteur tried to do is building on the foundation of the first report, recognizing the invisibility of persons with disabilities across the peace continuum. We try to focus in much more closely on the conflict of hostilities, what militaries do and don't do, how they train and prepare, what their military manuals say. And as was alluded to by Alex, what we ended up doing was bringing state militaries together with organizations of persons with disabilities in 3 regions. The first region was Central South America. The second region was Africa. I know Africa is a very large region, but to cover that one. And then the other one was North Africa and the Middle East. And from this partnership with IDA, DICANIA, ICRC, as well as the mandate, we were able to bring together a significant amount. This was the first time that the militaries have gotten together with organizations of persons with disabilities face to face, I mean, virtually, but face to face, and discuss the issues of what are the obligations of IHL in relation to persons with disabilities. What does Article 11 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities mean? And what does the obligations illustrated in Security Council Resolution 2475, how can these be implemented in a meaningful way? One of the biggest things that we found was across the board, the militaries felt correctly that IHL, the general protections of civilians under international humanitarian law, provided for the protection of persons with disabilities. There was no question to that, everyone agreed. However, as is explicitly listed within or explicitly mentioned within the Geneva Conventions, albeit using outdated language, persons with disabilities are required to have special protections provided to them because they face different challenges and risks than the general population. And this gap between understanding the fact that there needed to be a bridge between, yes, the general protections do of course include persons with disabilities, but there is an obligation under IHL to provide more specific protections to address their needs. This during the consultations was something that was a light bulb moment for a lot of militaries. On the first day, it was most organizations were talking past each other. The OPDs were explaining their problems and the militaries were saying, oh, well, we do X, Y, and Z. But then by the second day, they were starting to problem solve and really get to the point of understanding that there are specific needs and the general protections don't actually reach the persons with disabilities, which is why you have this larger impact. You have more death, you have more injury, you have more harm coming to persons with disabilities because of lack of consideration. And this goes back originally to the idea of the invisibility. So based on these consultations and responses to the questionnaires that were sent out to human rights organizations, governments, their militaries, and the UN, really what came of it were 5 common areas of failure where the full implementation of the IHL obligation to consider and protect persons with disabilities and the conduct of hostilities were identified. So I'm going to list these. They may not exactly fit as areas, but these were the main focal points that came out of the consultations. First was inaccessible communication. We heard about that already today. At checkpoints, the inability to understand verbal commands, the inability to provide, assistance or understanding to a person with an intellectual disability by the military, and often results in violence or death. The second is exclusion from evacuation procedures. The Ukraine example is one that I think is very evident, where there are evacuation procedures, but persons with disabilities have to obtain the evacuation themselves. They're not considered. They have to get special buses or get special treatment for them, but they do it themselves, not the state. This is where the issue is, or the military, or the authorities that are evacuating the individuals. The third, as was stated from Cameroon, is the enhanced risk of sexual and gender-based violence. This is very clear. The intersectional identities of women, girls, boys with and the identity of a disability on top of that is a compounding discrimination, which creates additional. So you have the risk of already being a child with a disability, or a child during an armed conflict, then a child with a disability. It compounds. It isn't separated. The fourth is a gap in disability data. This is a strange area. I also very much caution against this, and the rapporteur does as well, is that you can't use, states and state militaries cannot use the lack of information as to how many persons with disabilities exactly live in an area as a fig leaf to remove any responsibility of them to create an action. And this will go to some of the recommendations that we have that I'll list below. And then a lack of engagement with the disability community, and I think this has been themed throughout, just really running through and I think encompassed by that statement of invisibility, right? If you're not included, you're not engaged, you're not there, you don't count, right? This is the essence of nothing about us without us, the CRPD motto, so on and so forth. Well, maybe not the motto, but often adopted by the organizations of persons with disabilities as the motto. So the important part is that even though there is this explicit obligation to provide specific protection for persons with disabilities in armed conflict, there's been no adjustments in training, pre-deployment preparation, rules of engagement, standard operating procedures for the weapons bearers to have them reflect the duty to provide the specific protection and consideration of persons with disabilities in armed conflict. So this was the overall finding of the report that the special rapporteur submitted to the UN General Assembly. There are a couple conclusions, general ones that can be drawn that provide guidance on how states and their militaries can more fully implement IHL obligations to consider and protect persons with disabilities. The first is the starting point that there must be, that the concern for the protection of persons with disabilities is already enshrined in the text of international humanitarian law and customary international humanitarian law. As I said, using outdated language, medical model, but you have to think at the time that it was written. The ICRC has done an excellent job of updating the commentaries and the interpretation to reflect the modern day understanding of disability, away from the charity model and medical model, which, just because I'm speaking somewhat in terms that maybe people don't understand, the charity model is that a person with a disability can do nothing for themselves and must rely on the charity of others. This is not a correct view, but then also the medical model that disability is something that needs to be fixed. And this is also not a proper model of looking at it. The CRPD adopts the human rights, social rights model instead. The most important part about understanding that the obligations are reflected in IHL is that this means that any advocacy to ensure the fulfillment of the obligation to provide the specific consideration protection of persons with disabilities should not be seen as imposing an external obligation outside of what international humanitarian law already provides, meaning that it exists there. We are just recognizing it within the realm of the CRPD and the other human rights obligations. This is the same that has been done with the CEDAW and the CRC as well. The second obligation is that there must be an explicitly providing for trainings and educations of weapon bearers within the military manuals and standard operating procedures, pre-deployment preparations, and rules of engagement, meaning that when we look through the NATO training manuals that are used by most of the Western European militaries, it contains no mention of persons with disabilities and no mentions of obligations and no mention of the specific consideration and protections that need to be in there, which given Security Council, the existence of Security Council Resolution 2475 is a bit odd, but maybe they need to catch up. So it's been a couple of years in the pandemic, but recognizing that it does need to come into these manuals and operating procedures need to explicitly consider persons with disabilities the same way that they do for women and children. The third is in line with Article 31 of the CRPD, that the recommendation is to collect data disaggregated by disability, age, gender, among other attributes by states, and specifically for militaries in their after action and civilian casualty reports. This is to determine the impact of those operations on persons with disabilities in order to better understand those operational, tactical, and strategic deficiencies that may have caused more harm to be inflicted on persons with disabilities, or why they weren't able to evacuate or escape or understand the warnings that the militaries may have provided. The fourth is that there must be meaningful and sustained dialogue between states and their militaries and organizations of persons with disabilities, especially when they're mapping the civilian needs and the sharing of experiences and insights to ensure that when states and their militaries create civilian protection frameworks, that the needs of persons with disabilities are considered and included within it. This goes to an idea of civil military relations, which many militaries and states do conduct, but very often as part of civil society, organizations of persons with disabilities are not included, therefore excluding them from it. I think I got 8 minutes, so I'm not going to go too much longer, Elham, I promise. Just for the states, some key recommendations beyond the general ones that I provided is that in line with Article 4 of the CRPD, states should proactively engage with organizations of persons with disabilities as part of engagement with civil society. This is essential to bring them out of the veil of invisibility. Need to encourage national committees on IHL, Alex alluded to this as well, to deepen their knowledge of the obligation under international humanitarian law to provide specific consideration to persons with disabilities, while also seeking to include persons with disabilities on those committees to ensure a dialogue occurs as to the specific lived experience of the persons with disabilities. This is also consistent with Article 33 of the CRPD. Lastly, for states, adhere to the principle of accessibility in the dissemination of international humanitarian law information, including new and innovative methods that promote the respect of IHL through digital and other means. Essentially, it is the idea that putting out a book that is not then in Braille or able to be put online to use as a screen reader is not helpful. The education needs to occur within the disability community to also understand that there are rights that they can advocate for with the states and the militaries to ensure their better inclusion and protection during times of armed conflict. For the state militaries, this is going to be very simple. So in the absence of reliable data, as I suggested, as a fig leaf, we cannot use that as a way to erase obligations. State militaries should maintain an operational assumption that persons with disabilities comprise at least 15% of any civilian population that will be affected by their military operation. It's very simple. You just put a baseline in there, and once better data comes in, you can work off of that. Raising awareness and sensitization at all levels of the military through specific training in collaboration with organizations of persons with disabilities on the particular harm, risks, and needs of persons with disabilities during military operations. The thing that I think we learned most from these regional consultations was really that the militaries want to abide by their international humanitarian law obligations, but they are not familiar with disability. They don't interact with the disability community. They don't maybe feel comfortable doing it as well. And they want to be told how to do it appropriately by persons with disabilities, but they don't, that sensitization needs to be brought together. The two groups need to speak more, as Alex suggested, also having more regional consultations on a consistent basis. As I said, develop civil and military relations in a meaningful, sustained dialogue. This goes to the consultations. And lastly, develop specific trainings and simulation exercises in cooperation with organizations of persons with disabilities and persons with disabilities on the operationalization of the principles of distinction, proportionality, precautions, using a disability lens for those involved in targeting decisions, whether pre-planned or dynamic. And this, just basically to say this, is the idea that when the military conduct training operations, they usually have actors there, right, that act as the civilian population to understand how it is. They don't represent persons with disabilities within those trainings. This is what the suggestion is, to say that if you're conducting an urban operation and you know that there's 15%, we'll use that standard 15% of the population will be a civilian with a disability, the military should represent that in their trainings. They should consult with persons and OPDs so that their actors represent exactly the needs and reactions that persons with disabilities may have, so the militaries don't have the same deadly reaction that they may have at a checkpoint, that understanding how to react to persons with disabilities in those situations and also consider them. So that was it. I do apologize if it went over or spoke too fast for the translators and captioners. So thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you so much, William. Indeed, that was a great comprehensive list of recommendations for governments. I hope that these can be operationalized together with organizations of persons with disabilities, those who are advocating for protection of civilians and other actors. Of course, the one key actor in this field is the United Nations. UN as a military entity itself, because of the peace missions that UN is managing, as well as the role that UN has in terms of civil military coordination, documenting a violation of international humanitarian law and human rights during armed conflict, and many other ways. Unfortunately, today has fallen to the UN public holiday, and also colleagues in the civil military coordination team had a kind of parallel event happening exactly at the same time. So I don't think that we have anyone from them in the audience. But this is, we have tried to reach out as well to colleagues from the Peace Department, but unfortunately those were not available as well. But this is an important area, and I think, well, we heard a lot about the IHL, we heard a lot about the governments, and we really wished, and the reason that I still kept that in the concept note and in the agenda was that, of course, we don't have someone to talk about that, but this is not going to be removing this from our agenda. This is still on the agenda, and we hope that we can have more from the UN, what they are doing and what are they planning to do to break the cycle of exclusion for persons with disabilities in armed conflict. So I want to stop in here. We are going to open up for questions, comments, feedback from the floor, including what we suggested at our last segment, to try to find some actionable points for yourself based on what you are doing, based on what your role is. Even someone who is like thinking that they don't have a very important decision-making power, I think they can still do some step to break this cycle of exclusion. So, for example, one person was telling me in the last event that we had, like, I'm an intern with a UN agency, what we can do, and my suggestion was that even if you are like sometimes assigned to write a research, prepare some talking points, preparing social media messages, or whatever you are responsible, you can raise this topic, even if it's like in further like prioritization of topics is not eventually picked up. It's still an important topic. So if there is anyone in the room, let's start with the people in the room who wants to take the floor for any questions, comments, or any thought they have about what they want to do or they can do, or need assistance from us to help them to shape what they want to do. It's now your turn. Have anybody?
Richard in front row.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brian Frankel from the Permanent Mission of Israel. I'm really happy to be here, and it's good to have all the panelists. I know a lot of you participated even in the consultations, the special report there, and good to have Alex online as well. Working for. First of all, thank you for bringing this discussion. I think that it's very useful. see some colleagues who were in the group of friends working on these issues constantly. And Elham, I take your invitation of trying to think what we can do. And from there, I have also a question for Alex, but also reflection for us. From my side, I think that I'm trying to work very intensely on fighting this idea of not keeping it invisible. And we're trying to put it everywhere. And I think that some colleagues here in Geneva were awakening kind of this to make sure that in every resolution and in every discussion that we have, we can make sure to have some discussion of that with some progress, some success, some setbacks with colleagues that are saying one reference is enough, or that they believe that only those specific discussions referring to persons with disabilities should involve the consultations with persons with disabilities. And we're trying to say no, because they're in every aspect of life, they're part of our society. So it's very important to listen to them everywhere. So from my side, it's a very strong commitment to try to have it everywhere. But Alex, you mentioned the conference, and today we received the concept note for the upcoming conference. I know that it's still not very clear where it's going to go, and it's just an initial concept note for the conference for next year. But for what I read, I didn't see anywhere where we can think having these kind of discussions there. It sounds very general on IHL. So if you have any idea of if we're going to have something similar to what we have last time, that we have some more interesting discussions, or we focus on mental health and psychosocial support. And I think that was very useful for us to have the discussion here. So I think that I'm throwing you the ball on that regard of what the ICRC can do. But I think that it's interesting because you mentioned that, and I read the concept note this morning, and I couldn't see any reference to that so far. And I'm planning to make that as one of the comments from Israel, to some feedback to the concept note. But I'm wondering if you have some insights on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Do we have more questions in the room?
Yes, hello, I'm Isabelle de Muse from OCHA, the Disability Inclusion Focal Point in OCHA. I have a question concerning the consultations that took place in the various regions with the militaries. I would be interested to know more about what was the level of the militaries that participated in these consultations. Were there militaries from the army, or were there people really able to take decisions and make things change? And then also another question is about these consultations were very useful, I understand. Have you foreseen to have some more, or what is the next steps to these consultations?
Thank you, Isabel. Any more questions in the room?
Ram, working for CRS and as the cash and voucher working group co-chair in Afghanistan. So this is an issue I actually faced recently in reviewing cash assistance transfer values and the MEB related to it. So we were trying to look at how we can recommend transfer values for families that have members with persons with disabilities. So we try to work with our colleagues to look at some global guidance to see, let's say for an average family, we can give this amount, but if they have somebody with disability, we can increase by X amount. So there wasn't any sort of global guidance. And I think this is for somebody like me who's operational, who could have recommended that the lack of guidance on that, and the lack of, I mean, it's a simple quantification, right? Yeah. As you said, it's 15% out of the population. But we tried very hard to look into that, but we couldn't find any sort of precedents to use. And I'm aware that in Ukraine, they actually looked at this specific issue, but I haven't seen the report and if it had made any specific recommendations to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have 3 questions. Let's try to answer them. Alex, do you want to go first?
Yes, I think at least the first question was very directly addressed to me. Thank you very much, Brian, for your question and your interest. And to reassure you, it's still also internally for us quite early stages. So we are not necessarily hiding away anything more specific that has not found its way yet into the concept note. But that said, I'm personally clearly in favor of proposing something in terms of IHL and disability, and we are currently discussing what we could do as we speak. So a couple of elements that could be explored are, of course, one part of this is further awareness raising at the conference itself. So this might take a variety of forms. There is the possibility, of course, to have official commissions or a side event or a side event. Each of these possibilities might have their own advantages and disadvantages. And then what would be very useful is perhaps to propose some kind of model pledges that could, hopefully quite specifically take up some of the great substance that has already been elaborated as part of some of these regional consultations. So yeah, that's a little bit in terms of the first question, and I will leave perhaps mostly if William wants to complement or somebody else for the regional consultations. But just to say, in terms of the militaries, these were mostly people that are some of our regular interlocutors, at least for ICRC in terms of IHL confidential dialogue. So mostly people from capitals, from headquarters. But what was not necessarily present in these regional consultations were then the people that could make also the link perhaps to multilateral forums more globally, and this was perhaps something that was remarked that could still be further developed. And in terms of the consultations, yes, indeed, there would be value to have more of these, including perhaps that states themselves might take this kind of ownership. Yeah, I would just like to throw that out there. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. William, do you want to add anything about the military disability consultations?
Sure. First of all, thank you for your interest in it. It was a very large undertaking to do it. I think that we were very ambitious and we accomplished it. But I think that there is the one thing that we heard from each region was that the militaries and the OPDs wanted to continue this conversation. They asked if the ICRC could do it. They asked if the Special Rapporteur could do it. Obviously, understanding that we use the convening powers of all of these organizations, along with the help of IDA, to really identify the OPDs, to bring them together. And the hope, I guess, was really to have the spark so that we can continue it. The problem is a bit that it's news now, but the Special Rapporteur will not be taking a second term. So that lies with the new Special Rapporteur, whoever that may be, to take it or not take it. So I think the idea is there and the will is there, and whether we can house it in an area, and I think change it. I don't think they need to be as broad as they were. I think you can choose specific states and militaries that are maybe already working on the topic, interested in the topic, with countries that have a bit more robust OPD, because representation, because when we're talking about international humanitarian law, it's very niche, right? You need, in militaries, when you talk to them about these obligations, you almost need to always be a lawyer. They don't, or from the ICRC, or they're not going to listen to you. I mean, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but in the sense that there's a level of capacity that needs to be built with OPDs already exists to an extent. So really finding the areas where we could, pilot these maybe in different regions around the world, with one country and one military is probably the best solution to move forward. What that looks like under the new special rapporteur, or with ICRC, or however who wants to take it forward, I think is really the question. But I think they're exceptionally valuable because it does what the Ukraine report did. It brought those stories directly to the militaries, and the militaries think to them. I mean, and Alex, you can jump in and Elham as well, but really the militaries are like, oh, well, I know exactly how to train that out or adjust the training or the procedures in order to do that, but they wouldn't have heard that story otherwise, right? So I think it's very important to do. Where it sits right now, unclear, but I would love to chat with you a bit about it because OCHA might have a better solution, more stable. No, so yeah.
Thank you very much, William. I mean, realize we are running behind. We are going over time actually, but very quickly on the question about cash. The Interagency Standing Committee guidelines on inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action does have some recommendations about cash for persons with disabilities. The thing is, there is no like specific amount or like specific quantitative guidance on that. What we usually recommend is disability related costs, which best way to identify that is a need assessment based on the direct conversation with a person with disability and their family, or even better, engaging with organizations of persons with disabilities if they exist, to get a kind of idea of what are the additional disability related costs. Just give two quick examples and then I will wrap up. Is for example, the assistive devices that people with disabilities need, the health related, some of persons with disabilities have some health challenges that require medication, specific medication. But in addition to that, one thing that needs to be considered is the transportation expenses, because they cannot use the public transportation usually, even if it's available or accessible, it's not usually accessible. So I think based on the context that you're based, do a kind of assessment on disability related costs. And the best way to do that is to talk with persons with disabilities and their families to get an idea of what are those disability related costs. But if you have further questions, happy to discuss that later. Unfortunately, we don't have time for further questions. Thank you very much to the sponsors, the Mission of Finland in Geneva, Mission of Switzerland in Geneva, the International Committee of Red Cross, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I want to also thank our captioners and interpreters who helped to make this event accessible. I also want to thank my colleagues in the logistic team of the International Disability Alliance who were helping to make sure that this event is accessible to everybody on the panel, especially colleagues from overseas, from Syria, Nawaf from Lebanon, and Armel from Cameroon, and colleagues who took the time to be with us today. I hope that you could leave this room with some concrete recommendation or at least some concrete questions to think about. Thank you.
Thank you.
That were here, I say
Person, huh? Saying yeah, like many times on the computer, huh? Good.
I can find this.